Hey everybody, it's Ryan on the Max Afterburner channel. I wanted to get this out to you as soon as possible. It's the Air India 171 preliminary report, and it's definitely shocking. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Check out this image of the Boeing 787 cockpit. So these are the fuel cutoff switches. You could also refer to them as the engine master switches. So if you look at them, they're big, and they have a two-part actuation. So you have to actually pull out in order to move it, so you can't accidentally bump these switches. So here in this image, the left fuel control switch is put in the run position. The right one is in the off position. And it was found in this report that both of these switches were in the off position, which is just shocking. I was really hoping it would be something different than that. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I'll get to throughout this video. These are the engine run switches here on the top panel. So basically you're gonna have the fuel switches on to make sure that fuel is gonna go to the engines, and then you turn and hold these switches in the start position. They're actually automatic. You can just twist them and they'll stay there, and then the engine will start up and then they'll pop back to the norm position after it started. I've flown the Boeing 737 and it had a similar type setup. It wasn't as advanced as this, but this gives you guys an idea of how hard it is for these switches to accidentally move. So it's very concerning to me that this happened, but here's another close-up look of those fuel control switches. So these are both in the cutoff position. To put them in the run position, you pull out and then you flip up. That's how you get them into the actual run position. So that's going to be important for this video. I'll give a full breakdown of that preliminary report. I want to say also my thoughts and prayers are with all the families that are affected by this terrible tragedy. I've got the lights behind me set to yellow just as a sign of respect to all those affected. And this information will be important for the breakdown. It's a quick summary of the wreckage. The flap handle assembly suffered major heat damage from the fire, but it was securely positioned at 5. And 5 degrees is it's a standard setting for takeoff in the Boeing 787. So as expected, if that flap handle wasn't set in the correct position, if this thing took off with 0 flaps, the aircraft would be squawking so loud that there's just almost essentially, I'm not going to say zero, but basically such a low chance of that happening. So this makes sense to me that the flaps were actually positioned at 5, which is a normal takeoff position for the 787. And it's important to note that both fuel control switches were discovered in the run position. And again, I'm going to give you guys my full breakdown on why I think they were put back to the run position later in the video. Air India 171 was set to operate from Ahmedabad to London's Gatwick Airport. It had an estimated departure time of 0740 UTC or 1310 local time. The crew included an ATPL, that's an airline transport pilot license holding pilot in command. Pilot in command means the captain, and a CPL holding co-pilot. That is a commercial pilot license holding co-pilot. So to get the ATP, it takes more experience. Both of the pilots were Mumbai based, and they had arrived the day before, and reports showed that they had plenty of rest. Rest periods for pilots are mandated by regulations to prevent fatigue, which is a common factor in accidents, and likely this crew had the ability to speak up and say they were fatigued if fatigue played any part in this situation, which we'll get to here in a second. The co-pilot was the pilot flying, so that means they're going to handle the controls. They're actually going to have their hands on the stick and throttle, while the captain was the pilot monitoring, or PM. And as the pilot monitoring, you're overseeing all the instruments and you do the communications once you get in the air. Usually the first officer, the co-pilot, is going to do all the communications on the ground. So the aircraft pushed back and taxied as normal. They taxied to the end of the runway and they lined up for takeoff. Their takeoff clearance came and they began their takeoff. The takeoff roll from start to acceleration to liftoff lasted about 62 seconds based on the timestamps, and that's typical for a 787 at these weights and configuration. So according to the flight data recorder, the 787 passed V1 at 153 knots at 8:08:33 seconds UTC. Then they arrived at VR 155 knots 2 seconds later, and then they lifted off at 8:08:39 UTC. And that was determined because in the flight data recorder, it actually shows you when the air and ground sensors switch to an air mode, and it switches to an air mode when the weight come off the wheels. The 787 reached a maximum airspeed of 180 knots, and that happened at 8:08:42 UTC, and then immediately after, engine 1 and then engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff. That was 1 second apart. And And then the N1 and the N2 speeds began to bleed down as the fuel was cut off from flowing to the engines. And N1 and N2, those are fan and core fan speeds in the engine's turbine section. So it gives you a really good idea of what's happening inside the engine itself. So if those things are spinning back, as well as the RPM, the repetitions per minute, you really know you have an issue. And that sudden transition, whatever caused it, which we'll get to here in a second, that caused the dual engine failure essentially right after liftoff. And it's very fishy that it happened directly after liftoff. Here's where things get wild, guys. In the cockpit video recorder, one pilot asks, "Why did you cut off?" The other replies, "I did not do so." So it doesn't actually say in the report who said what, but one of the pilots asks, "Why did you cut off?" So they notice right then that the engines are cut off. You're gonna see those fan blades start to roll back. You're gonna feel it as the jet stops climbing, and this jet only reached a top speed of about 180 miles per hour. So something is going extremely wrong at this point. The pilot says, "I did not do so," stating, "Hey, I didn't do it. I don't know what's going on." So we have to talk about the idea that maybe these switches moved unintentionally, right? I want to give credit to the pilots right off the bat before we move into the discussion of pilot error. However, I will say in the report, it talks about a 2018 FAA Special Worthiness Information Bulletin. It highlights potential issues with the locking features disengaging on Boeing 737, so not the 787, but based on operator reports of switches installed without the lock engaged. So there is precedent of this happening on a 737 without there being a lock. So while not deemed unsafe enough for a mandatory airworthiness directive, that means essentially grounding the fleet, the design included a specific part number, and that specific part number is similar, not exactly the same, but very similar across models like the 787. And Air India said they didn't perform the advisory inspections since the SAIB was non-mandatory. So maintenance records show the throttle control module on VT-A and B, that's the unique serial number for this aircraft, was replaced in 2019 and 2023 for unrelated reasons with no fuel switch defects reported. So if these switches somehow, due to that liftoff, maybe they weren't fully in the run position, and again, they're designed so that shouldn't happen. They click into position, you can feel it. But if for some reason, if they were lazily put into position and they were resting in that exact perfect spot where they weren't quite in run and they weren't quite in cutoff, but the engine was getting enough fuel, then maybe as the plane lifted off, they could fall backwards into that cutoff position. That's highly unlikely. And again, I think they would slip into one spot or the other, but who knows? Anything is possible. Maybe it's that 1 in a million chance. But both of them being put in that position where they're a 1 in a million chance, that just seems very odd to me. So the flight data recorder shows both engines into those turbine fan blades dropping below idle just a few seconds after takeoff, and then the rat is going to activate. Engine 1 cutoff switch went back to run at 8:08:52 UTC a few seconds later. APU inlet door opened shortly thereafter for an auto start, which is auto logic in an APU. It is automatic start logic in a 787 that has a loss of power like this. And then the engine 2 run switch goes to run at 8:08:56. The APU or auxiliary power unit, that's a small jet engine in the tail that provides backup power. In flight, it automatically starts regardless of selector position if 3 or more engine generators fail, such as during a dual engine shutdown where all 4 engine mounted generators, 2 per engine, go offline. This auto start happened here because the engine failures cause a massive loss of electrical generation, prompting the system to bring the APU online for recovery. But as you can see, one of the pilots tried to restart this. So if you looked down in this situation as a pilot and you just had that unfortunate, just heart-sinking moment where you see both of those switches in the cutoff position, you know you have to at least try to restart them. So the left switch is going to go on first, and then the right switch is going to go on second to try to get fuel back to these engines. And then the throttles are going to stay up where they were. So they're basically staying at takeoff power. The flight data recorder shows exactly that. It shows that a restart was attempted. And moving those switches back to run triggers the FADEC, and that is a full authority digital engine control. It attempts to relight, it ignites fuel and tries to restart the engines as fast as possible. You can think of the FADEC as a computerized brain of the engine. It automatically controls fuel flow, ignition timing, thrust levels, and other parameters based on sensor inputs that reduces pilot workload and optimizes performance during normal operations and especially during emergencies like this. And the preliminary report shows that EGT, the exhaust gas temperature, rose for both engines, and that indicates a relight attempt. Engine 1 began recovering, but engine 2 struggled, repeatedly introducing fuel, unable to start, likely due to the slow airspeed. And then at 8:09 UTC, one of the pilots squeezed out a mayday call, hinting at a loss of engine thrust. So is it possible for these cutoff switches to accidentally move on the Boeing 787? They are designed with a guard mechanism to prevent unintentional activation. It's a two-step process like I talked about before. So pilots must lift the switch to unlock. That overcomes a detent or a solenoid lock, and then pull it aft to the cutoff position. So myself, as a commercial airline pilot, it is highly unlikely for accidental movement of this switch. It's just not something you can bump into, and it's nothing I've ever seen before. I've never seen an accidental actuation of this switch. So maintenance records do show that the throttle control model on VT A and B, that's the unique serial number for this 787 that crashed, it was replaced in 2019 and 2023 for unrelated reasons, with no fuel switch defects reported by any pilots. So it's essentially super rare for that lock to not be installed, and for no other pilots to have noticed that. This would just be a glaring issue. If you went to move that switch and there was no lock, it would just flip down and flip up. You would definitely not take that jet. You would have maintenance come fix it. So the crew that flew it before them, they would have noticed that, and then this crew would have noticed it as well. Okay, so now just a quick overview, myself as a pilot. So if this switch in the very random situation was installed incorrectly, maybe it could flip back to cutoff on that takeoff. So maybe that could be one of the reasons. Again, I don't want to just fully blame this on the pilot, so I want to talk about that first. Maybe there's something there. However, from all that I can see, all that I've read, it doesn't seem to me that that could actually happen. The crew prior flew this without mentioning any types of issues with those fuel control switches. So potentially this pilot either was extremely fatigued, who accidentally switched these switches into the cutoff positions, or God forbid, it was done on purpose. Either way, this is an incredibly tragic event, but I hope this helps you get a better idea of potentially what happened. So right now, there is no clear cause. There will be that official report that will come out in about a year, and I'll keep you posted. Thanks so much for watching this video. The best compliment you can give me is just watch this video right here. It's teed up specifically for you. So I'll see you on this video right here. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.